Hi, my name is Mike Dillard, and this is Self-Made Man, the podcast for men who want to leave their mark on the world and create a legacy of honor, integrity, and achievement in every aspect of their lives. I'm glad you're here, and once again, it is time to forge your destiny. So one of my personal goals in life is to constantly seek to understand the world as it actually is rather than how I wish to see it. Because refusing to do so means that I am consciously choosing to live within a lie. And if you live within a lie, you're simply a part of the problem. Now, as entrepreneurs who seek to better our own lives through the benefit of others, we look at the world through a lens of optimism and abundance. It's really a distortion that we choose to create because it helps us accomplish our goals. It helps us stay motivated. But it also blinds us to the reality of the world, which can be infinitely darker and filled with questions of morality with endless shades of gray. Well, today's show is a wake-up call that the world is filled with people who seek money, power, and influence at any cost. People and institutions who operate within the gray and who justify their actions no matter how horrendous, either in the name of their own good and the lining of their pockets or for the greater good. For example, would you overthrow a government and start a war that would result in the deaths of 10,000 people if it would benefit the lives of 10 million? Well, these are the decisions being made every day, and this is the world that we actually live in. And our guest today was one of these individuals. His name is John Perkins, and for 10 years, he was an economic hitman for the United States. John was the chief economist at one of the biggest international consulting firms out there, where he advised the World Bank, the United Nations, the IMF, and the U.S. Treasury Department, along with Fortune 500 companies and governments in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East. And his role was to convince leaders of underdeveloped countries to accept huge development loans for large construction and engineering projects while making sure that these projects were contracted to U.S. companies like Halliburton. Well, later these loans would give the U.S. political influence and access to natural resources for U.S. companies. So that was the long-term play and manipulation. It was, in a word, and continues to be, extortion and financial bondage on a global level. And if the leaders of these countries declined John's offer, the jackals were sent in to kill them, which they did. And you will hear about those accounts here in today's episode. Welcome to reality, my friends. And once the veil has been pulled off, it means we all have the opportunity to do something about it. So please help me welcome John Perkins. John Perkins, welcome to Self-Made Man.
Thank you, Mike. It's great to be with you this day.
Absolutely. So I was a big fan of your book years ago when I first came across it, probably 7 or 8 years ago now. And I'm super excited that our paths have finally had the opportunity to cross and that we finally get to discuss this, because I find this particular topic absolutely fascinating and incredibly pertinent to every single person on the planet today, which I believe you do as well. But before we get into that, I would love it if you could share your story as a essentially proclaimed economic hitman for the Gov back in your early career, because it's absolutely fascinating. I don't think a lot of people actually believe that it exists and that there is this kind of agenda that goes on a daily basis between people of power and institutions of power on this planet.
Yes, well, it certainly does exist, unfortunately. And that's one of the reasons I wrote the new Confessions of an Economic Hitman, because it's actually gotten worse. But let me step back and say what an economic hitman is. And to start with, I think it's fair to say that economic hitmen have created the world's first truly global empire. And it's really not an American empire. It's a corporate empire. And actually, that can be good news, and we can get into that later. But it is an empire. And the way economic hitmen work is that, well, the most general way is that we will identify countries that have resources our corporations covet, like oil, arrange huge loans to those countries from the World Bank or sister organizations. But the money doesn't actually go to those countries. It goes to our own corporations that make huge profits out of building big infrastructure projects in those countries, power plants, industrial parks, highways, ports, airports, things that benefit some wealthy families in those countries who basically are behind the economic statistics. So the statistics look good, But the majority of the people in the country suffer because money is diverted from health care, education, other social services to pay off the debt service, the interest on the debt. And in the end, the principal is not bought down. And so we go back and say, hey, since you can't pay your debt, sell your resource, oil or whatever, real cheap to our corporations without any social regulations or environmental restrictions, or privatize. Sell at discount rates your utilities, your water and sewage system, your electric utility, your schools, your banks, your prisons, all your public sector businesses to our corporations at cut rate prices. And in the few cases, Mike, where we fail, the jackals go in. These are people that either overthrow governments or assassinate their leaders, and unfortunately, the United States has a record of doing this. We've admitted to taking out the leaders of Allende of Chile and Arbenz of Guatemala, Mossadegh of Iran, Diem of Vietnam, Lumumba of the Congo, and two of my clients who didn't play the game and were assassinated, Jaime Roldos of Ecuador and Omar Torrijos of Panama. And really, in that way, we've created this global corporate empire.
Can you dive into the details behind those two stories? Because this is, there literally have been movies made about scenarios like this, but you were there, you lived this. Can you talk a little bit about what it was like to get that assignment, and who did it come from, and what happened?
Well, yeah, let's start with Jaime Roldos of Ecuador. I'd been a Peace Corps volunteer in Ecuador in the late 60s, so I knew the country well. I speak Spanish fluently. Then I was a Peace Corps volunteer in the late 60s. In the early 70s, military junta was a dictatorship, was in charge of Ecuador. We economic hitmen convinced this junta to take these huge loans like I described. A lot of it was in support of Texaco, building roads to help Texaco move into the Amazon rainforest, which subsequently has had a huge lawsuit. It lost about all the destruction it caused in there. And the junta took these massive loans to build roads to help Texaco and some of their rich families there and the generals themselves, and hydroelectric projects and other big projects that fed the very wealthy. Then in the late 70s, 1978, a president a candidate ran, whose name was Jaime Roldos, in the first democratic election in many, many years in the country. Roldos ran on a platform of changing this, of getting more money to his people, including taxing the oil companies, Texaco in particular, and making sure that they shared their profits with the Ecuadorian people. And also he wanted to increase the minimum wage very significantly. He won the election, to our surprise. I was then sent down to convince him not to fulfill his campaign promises. But he had tremendous integrity. And so he stuck to his guns. And because of that, he died in a plane crash, a private plane crash that had all the markings of a CIA assassination. And during that same period of time, Omar Torrijos was head of state of Panama, and he was trying to renegotiate the Panama Canal Treaty so that with Jimmy Carter, so that the Panama Canal would revert to Panamanian ownership. And he was able ultimately successfully to do that. But he also was taking a huge leadership role in telling other countries in Latin America as well as his own. And in fact, his reputation was spreading throughout the world as someone who really stood up for national rights, to say, look, the United States doesn't have any right to come in here and dictate to us or to Ecuador or Colombia or Argentina or any country in Africa what our policies should be. And so he was becoming quite well known around the world. He was very charismatic, very well liked. I was sent in to convince him to change his ways, to lay off, to stop. I couldn't do it. He had tremendous integrity. Now, I go into a lot of detail in the New Confessions of an Economic Hitman behind all of this, and conversations I had with each of these men. But what I'm giving you here is the short version. And less than 3 months after Roldos's plane exploded, killing him, the same thing happened to Torrijos's plane. And again, all the evidence points toward assassination. I have no doubt whatsoever about it. And both of those presidents knew that they were vulnerable to this sort of thing, but they had tremendous courage and integrity.
So you're essentially the nice guy in the negotiation process that comes in, does your best to make an offer that you and the people you represent want to complete, and if they don't take it, then the bad guys show up and take what they want.
Yes, and it's I've discussed the two cases where I failed, where these heads of state had great integrity. I worked in many, many other countries where it was very successful, and it was, I had all the odds on my side because all of these presidents knew the stories of Lumumba and Allende and Arbenz and Mossadegh and later Roldos and Torrijos. They knew. And part of my story was, hey, listen, you and your friends who own industry, who own subcontractors, who dig ditches, who own the John Deere franchise, et cetera, you're going to get really wealthy off these contracts, a handful of people in your country, your friends and cronies. Or if you don't buy into this deal, well, just remember what happened in Chile and what happened in Guatemala and Iran and so on. And so these leaders all know the story. And so it was, my job was actually usually pretty easy. And it was a huge exception when a man had the sort of courage that both Roldos and Torrijos had, and they supported each other in that. That helped. But that was a real exception.
What is the real story behind Iraq and Saddam Hussein?
Well, it's a long story. I talk in the New Confessions about how in the early 70s, there was a big oil embargo imposed by OPEC against the United States because the Arab countries didn't like our policies toward Israel. It threatened to drive us into a huge depression, like the one of the 30s. And so the U.S. Treasury Department came to me and said, hey, we can't allow this to ever to happen again. Can't be blackmailed. Do something. I knew that doing something meant corrupting the House of Saud, the royal family of Saudi Arabia, because they controlled OPEC. And so I went off to Saudi Arabia and a number of trips. Again, the long story's in the book. The short version is that in the end, I convinced the House of Saud to accept this deal whereby they would return almost all their petrodollars to the United States by investing in U.S. Treasury securities. The interest from those security from that money would be used by the Treasury to hire U.S. corporations to essentially westernize Saudi Arabia, build oil refineries, desalination plants, huge cities out of the desert. And and also part of the deal was that oil would only be sold for U.S. dollars on the international market. And in return, we would guarantee that the House of Saud would be protected and stay in power. That was a very, very important agreement, and it's held to this day. But then after that, the next step was Saddam Hussein, because he was the second most powerful person after the House of Saud. And so economic hitmen were dispatched to convince him to do a deal similar to the Saudis. He wouldn't do it. And I don't know why, frankly. And so the first attack went in under the first President Bush, destroyed his military, and they figured that by doing that, he would now come around, but he didn't. And so the jackals were sent in. The jackals couldn't get at Saddam Hussein. He had very good security. He had lookalike doubles. Security officers didn't know whether they were really guarding him or an actor, and that makes it very hard to assassinate a person. And so by the time the second Bush became president, it was determined that he had to be taken out. And so he was taken out. And of course, we all know what's happened since, that Iraq has been destroyed. And of course, there's huge contracts there for Bechtel and other corporations, U.S. corporations, to rebuild the country. People are making huge fortunes off Iraq and Syria and Afghanistan. And of course, companies made huge profits off Vietnam. You and I may think we lose these wars, but the fact of the matter is the very wealthy win them.
Well, it's interesting if you just simply apply the strategy that day traders use is the opportunity is found in volatility. So the opportunity to profit, volatility, change, chaos, all of that brings opportunity to make money and insert your rules and change the dynamic. And I'm dying to ask you, given the history that you've just given us on the Middle East here, it kind of brings us to the third chapter. And I would love your answer on this because I don't know. What the hell is the United States and Obama doing with Iran?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And you get many different answers. I was recently interviewed by several different Russian TV hosts who came to my house up near Seattle, Washington, several different teams. My book's very popular in Russia. It's in 33 languages, so it's very popular in right-wing countries and left-wing countries, which is interesting to me. The Russians believe that we're in Syria because Syria is the watchdog for Iran, and we want to go to Iran next. And after that, we want to go to Russia. They believe we want to take Russia. And when I express tremendous skepticism about this, because I felt skepticism about it, they'll say, well, don't you remember the Cold War? And I say, yes. And I say, well, both the United States and the Soviet Union felt very threatened by each other. You guys won the Cold War, and the Soviet Union was destroyed. And since winning the Cold War, the United States has sent its military all over the world to take oil and gas resources from countries that have it. Russia has it. And so why wouldn't we fear you? The Russian people still fear us. So that's one story. But what I'd also say is that the very threat of war, and Iran is a threat of war, makes a lot of money for people. We don't actually have to go to war. Wars make money for people, but so does the threat of war. And as you said, destabilization, flux, instability, divide and conquer, all of that works to the advantage of big corporations, because if you don't have any strong local governments, if they're divided, if they're destabilized, it opens opportunities for people to make a lot of money. So, the Middle East, all of the Middle East, Iran, the whole area is dysfunctional to a large degree. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that many of the countries there shouldn't be countries. Borders were created by the colonial European powers 100 years ago or more. And these are dysfunctional places. And the current crisis between Sunnis and Shiite, between Arabs and Iranians, and between all of them and the Israelis, destabilize everything. What we need to understand is that we can't fix that. It should be obvious since 9/11 and all the money we sunk in and all the lives that have been lost, that violence has just gotten worse. We've done nothing to make the area more stable. We've done exactly the opposite. We've done nothing to make life safer for us or anyone else, including the Europeans. That should be obvious. This violence is not working for anyone except the people who make lots of money off wars and the threat of war.
So, before we depart from the Iran topic, and this is just me and the observations I'm making, and I'm trying to make sense of it, because you just mentioned that, one of the popular opinions out there within your circle is that this is part of the long-term plan to take out Syria, Iran, and then Russia. But if you look at the decisions and the policies Obama has been putting in place over the last couple of years, it almost appears that, and by the news and the press conferences and everything else he's done, that he's kind of giving the finger to Saudi Arabia and to Israel, and is now favoring and empowering Iran, almost as if the United States has made some kind of deal with Iran to make them the new power center and hub of the Middle East. That's what it looks like from the outside. Here, we'll get rid of sanctions. We'll give you access to hundreds of billions of dollars. We'll empower you to become a nuclear power, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what I'm seeing, and I'm trying to make sense of it.
So I think, Iran is a power center and has wanted to be recognized as that. Bob Baer, who's an extremely highly decorated former CIA operative, about whom the movie Syriana is based, George Clooney played him in the movie. And Bob Baer has written several books on this. He's a friend of mine, and he's always said one of the things, and he speaks Farsi and Arabic, one of the things he said is that the Iranians have always wanted to be recognized as being a power. And when we don't do that, it makes them very angry, and they want to rattle the saber more. So I think in a way, what Obama is doing here is being realistic and recognizing that they are a powerful country, and that we're not going to stop them from having nuclear weapons by threats of bombing them. We're only going to stop it by dropping the sanctions, by trying to work with them. A lot of people might not agree with this. I lived in Iran. I've spent a lot of time in Iran. Well, during a period of 10 years during the 70s, I was in Iran many, many, many times. I knew the Shah. I knew a lot of the leaders there. In general, I would say that the Iranians are very rational people. And they like sometimes to put someone on the stage, a prime minister or a president, someone who it may not be rational and sounds very rational, but behind it all, the Iranians are clever and they know what they're doing. They're good business people. They always have been. They're traders. They always have been. And I think Obama is recognizing the importance of trying to deal with this. I think at the same time, he's also recognizing that Israel is being very intransigent and it's refusing to recognize the problems of the Palestinians and so much of the Middle East. The Israelis have not been cooperating with the United States. They've been trying to strong arm us and using their connections through various lobbies and PACs to influence government. I think Obama is insulted by this, quite frankly.
Interesting. Yeah. It's been interesting to watch, and it's one or the other, and I haven't quite, been able to really figure out exactly, how that's going to end. But when you look at the world today, and you talk about these corporations and these powers that wield influence over these different countries, the military-industrial complex, who are they? Because specifically over the last couple of years, it's almost like there's this group of boogeymen out there behind the scenes that nobody knows, and they're making all of these decisions to kind of throw the world into chaos in many respects. Is that the case? Are governments and our political leaders still really the ones in power, or are there groups behind the scenes, whether it's in the CIA or on a corporate banking level, that are really making the decisions here?
Mike, you this is the most important point I think we can bring up, and that is that the governments do not control much, including the U.S. government. It's the big corporations. This is an election year, and it's a little appalling to see how many people really believe that if their candidate just gets elected, everything will change. Obama has shown us that's not the case. I suspect the guy has integrity. I suspect that he intended to do what he promised to do. But in many cases, he's done exactly the opposite. There's more drones, there's more militarization in the Middle East now than there was before he came into power, and on and on. And I don't blame him. I think he walked into a system where he had very little choice. The president, even if a president didn't accept any money from big corporations, and both Sanders and Trump say they won't, that president will be surrounded by everybody who does, senators, representatives from the House, lobbyists. These are people whose campaigns are financed by big corporations and who also realize that if they lose their next election or decide not to run, they'll get extremely lucrative jobs as consultants and lobbyists. So the president is surrounded by these kinds of people. And also the president realizes that he or she is very, very vulnerable, that Clinton was brought down by a sex scandal. In Kennedy's day, sex didn't matter. He had to be brought down by a bullet. Today, a scandal. And who doesn't have a skeleton in their closets? And even if we had a president who had no skeletons in their closets, which is practically inconceivable, but still that the FBI can create skeletons with their access to all of our social media and internet. They can do that. So our leaders understand that they are totally at the whim of big corporations. Big corporations are calling the shots, and this is not a conspiracy theory. I can get into this in more detail, but the corporations, all of these people who run the corporations are driven by a single goal, and that is to maximize profits regardless of social and environmental costs. It's a sick goal. It's a new goal that was only established in 1976. I can point to the exact way that it was established. We can get into that if you want, but it's a goal that's created a failed global economic system. There's no question that we have a failed global economic system. It's only working for a few rich people. And in the end, it won't work for them either. If the whole thing crashes, they're going to crash too. Well,
that brings me to my next question, which is the United States is still running around with their guns and their cannons and their sabers, and we're the biggest empire the world has ever seen since the days of Rome. And yet it would appear to be the case, if you've studied any amount of history, that we are entering the twilight of that empire. And if you look at the health of our financial system and economy and debt levels and every other measurement that you can possibly take a look at, we're on the verge of collapse, where we're every dollar we spend on the military and on expansion to support this infrastructure is just debt. And so are the people in Washington, our leadership in Washington, in complete denial? Are they that ignorant, or are they just don't believe that the United States is in that kind of position?
Well, as I said, the people in Washington really don't have much control. It's the people in Wall Street and the people behind our biggest corporations that have the power. I think they do understand, and a lot of them don't know what to do. And this is a critical point. I speak at a lot of business conferences, which might surprise a lot of people. But what I'm told, the reason I get invited to speak at these things is because CEOs are very smart people for the most part, and they can't help but see that things are in decline. The oceans are melting. The glaciers are melting. The oceans are rising. 2.5 billion people live at the poverty level or below it. 62 people have as much wealth as half the world's population. 7 out of 10 people live in countries where inequality is greater today than it was 30 years ago. The statistics are just appalling. And I think maybe the worst statistic is that less than 5% of us live in the United States and consume almost 30% of the world's resources, while half the world's starving or on the verge of starvation. That's not a model. China can't repeat that with 19% of the world's population. India can't. Brazil can't. We got to change. And these corporate executives know that, but they don't know what to do. And what I hear over and over from them, I hear this so many times. My corporate CEOs will tell me, I would like to do better. I've got children. I've got grandchildren. I want to create a green world, but I'm afraid if I lose 0.5% of market share in the next quarter, I'll be fired by my main stockholders and replaced by someone who only cares about market share. And what they ask me to do is they say, go out and spread the word. Tell people to overload us with emails saying, we love your product, but we're not going to buy it anymore until you change your ways. And then they say, we can take these emails to our main stockholders and say, hey, we've got to change, or they're not going to buy our product. And they'll say things like, we may lose market share in the short run, but in the long run, we're going to be a leader in the industry and emerge at the top. And I think that's really important for people to get, is that this world is run by big corporations, but big corporations aren't evil. They're just groups of people. And a lot of them are run by very good people. And even those that are run by sociopaths, and there's no doubt that there's some that are. Sociopaths are not driven by profit. They're driven by success. We've defined success as being profit. If we redefine success as being creating a life economy, creating a world that our children and grandchildren will thank us for, then the sociopaths will get on our side.
Well, the interesting part is if you look at the way nature works and has always worked, it always works in cycles, and it goes from extreme to extreme, where 80% of events in history are spent in the median somewhere. And then you have moments of extremes at the bottom and at the top. And it's those moments of extreme that cause change and reset. So if you look at what's happening today, I believe that we're getting close to that extreme when it comes to greed and profit and motive and things like that, which means that, we can see the big reset coming. And it's also interesting to observe with the millennials specifically, they're sensing that. They're seeing the impact of this extreme on the planet, with their finances, with the economy, with the job market. And they're starting to make decisions and to support companies who have the greater good as an agenda when it comes to their business model, for cause companies, for better companies, if you will. And those are the ones that are getting market share right now. So it's almost like nature is once again going to balance itself out here. And hopefully that will be the case with the next generation. The point you bring up is a fascinating one, because the millennials are understanding, I think, as are so many people across the planet, that we really do have power. We've seen in somewhat recent years, during my lifetime, we've seen small groups of people
convince corporations to clean up terribly polluted rivers in this country and to move more and more into renewable energy. Last year, we built more of solar and wind power in the United States than any other form of energy. That's a huge change from 10 years ago or even 5 years ago. Huge. People said it wouldn't happen. Corporations have opened their doors much wider to women and minorities. Just within the last month, we've seen 5 of the biggest food companies in the United States, Mars, Kellogg, General Mills, ConAgra, and Campbell's Soup, announce that they're going to label GMOs nationally across the country. And the reason that happened was because a very small number of people in a very small state with less than 0.2% of the U.S. population, Vermont, got laws passed in that state saying that these companies had to label GMOs in Vermont. As a result, the companies announced that they're going to do it nationally, not just Vermont, but everywhere. A very, very tiny percentage of the U.S. population, minuscule, got these companies to change. And as a result, I just heard the CEO of Monsanto, Hugh Grant, not the actor, but the CEO, on the radio the other day, and he's being impacted by this. Monsanto's understanding it's got to change because a very small number of people in a very small state convinced the big corporations to change their attitudes to GMOs. This is extremely significant. We've seen something else happen with minimum wage increases in California and New York, and to a certain degree in the state where I live, Washington, because a couple of years ago, 3 years ago, a few employees at McDonald's insisted on a wage increase. These movements are powerful. It doesn't take many people, Mike, and I think that's where we take great hope. And I think a lot of corporate executives take great hope in this too. As I said earlier, a lot of these corporate executives want to be pushed to do the right thing.
Yeah, and it's very interesting, and it's interesting to bring up the Monsanto thing because I didn't know that, but they are essentially the poster child for these evil corporations, if you will, in my mind, because this is a company who has bought so much sway in Congress and in Washington that they've literally gotten these laws passed to where they're not responsible for anything bad that happens to them, and they don't have to label their products and all of these other stuff as far as GMOs go. They don't have to compensate farmers who are poisoned by their herbicides and stuff like that, and they've just essentially bought their way to domination. So, I hope that really is the case. And I know that I think last year I read their profits, dove by over 30% as a result of all of the new awareness that's been coming out, on the market. So, we'll take that as a good sign for sure.
I have a friend who's a manager of investment funds, and he will not recommend Monsanto stock to anybody. He says because the company is either going to have to change or it's going to go down. And I think they're getting it. I think what the people of Vermont did is a huge step in the direction of convincing Monsanto that they've got to change their ways. And all of your listeners can continue to do this by sending emails, Facebook posts, getting all their friends to send emails to Monsanto and tell them that the writing's on the wall. Don't make them out to be the enemy. Say, hey, Monsanto, we want to help you stay in business and get better. We want to help you to be part of the life economy. Take this new law that was passed in Vermont that's impacting major corporations across the country as a warning and as an incentive. Now, change your ways.
Yeah. I mean, agreed. That'd be the most peaceful and uninterruptive way that you could possibly induce that change. So, what happens next with the world from the economic hitman standpoint? You've got this group of people. They still exist. They're still out there trying to influence the world and the United States agenda. And as we dive into that topic real quick as well, where does China play into this entire story?
Well, China's obviously stretching us, pushing us to the limits, us being the United States. And I think what we need to understand is that we have an amazing opportunity after the demise of the Soviet Union, 1991. The United States and our corporations had an amazing opportunity to go out into the world and show that democracy and our form of capitalism was really helpful, really works. But we didn't do that. Instead, we essentially exploited the world. And so now China comes along, and it wants the same things that a lot of our companies want: control of resources in Africa, Middle East, Latin America. And I think it's learned to a certain degree from our mistakes. It's not putting military bases in these places, which is a huge problem in many of the countries for the United States. I mean, I go to Latin America. I know the leaders of countries there. I speak Spanish fluently. And I hear from them, we'd rather take loans from China than the U.S. or the World Bank, which is controlled by the U.S., because China's never assassinated one of our leaders, never built a military base on our soil, never overthrown one of our governments. And I'll say things like, well, don't you think they will in the future? Their response is, maybe, but they haven't done it. You have. You've proven that you can do it and will do it. So, and I think that's really sad. I think it would be really nice if we understand that China is a competitor, is a rising star. Our star may be falling, and let's change it. Let's turn it around. We are still the country that the world looks to for leadership. If we can convince our corporations to move from this death economy to a life economy, the world will follow. And the Chinese will either be left in the dust or they'll follow too.
Well, it's good to see, the first company that pops in my head that is really, I think, burning the path, if you will, as far as this goes, is Tesla.
Yeah, Tesla is taking a leadership role, no question.
So where do we go from here as far as action steps go? Because I know that's a big part of your book here is making people aware of how the world actually works. I think the vast majority of mainstream America are absolutely unaware of, and even if they heard the stories, would just be in denial that such kind of evil agendas or heartless agendas actually exist out there, but they do. And what can we do about it? Because that's really what the focus is for you, specifically in your message for the world moving forward.
Well, Mike, I wouldn't call these heartless or evil agendas. I think they're based on a perception. I like to think of the American Revolution as being kind of a symbol. In 1773, the common belief throughout the Americas was that the British were invincible. George Washington stood up and said, no, they're not. And he remembered being present at the Battle of the Monongahela 20 years earlier during the French and Indian War, seeing a huge British army totally routed and destroyed by a small band of Indians. And Washington said, the British aren't invincible. All we got to do is hide behind trees. And they line up out there like sitting ducks in their red coats. And then Tom Paine and Thomas Jefferson wrote inspirational pamphlets. And in less than a year, the perceived reality in the United States changed from the British are invincible to we can defeat them. And the Revolutionary War was fought not against the British government so much as against the East India Company. And that's what the tea tax was all about. That's what the Boston Tea Party was all about. This was a company that controlled more than half the world's trade and imposed taxes on the United States. I mean, they did it through the crown, but they controlled the crown. After the revolution, the U.S. lawmakers wrote laws that vastly restricted the power of corporations. It said that corporations had to serve a public interest. That law endured until the late 1800s when it changed, and it's gotten worse since. Corporations have been allowed to get more and more powerful. But even when I was in business school in the late 60s, there was still this idea of serving a public interest. I was taught that a good CEO makes a decent rate of return for investors and is a good citizen, serves the public, pays taxes, imagine that, doesn't lay off employees until the CEO has taken cuts in salary himself first, and so on and so forth. That all changed in 1976 when Milton Friedman won the Nobel Prize in Economics and among other things stated the only responsibility of business is to maximize profits regardless of the social and environmental costs. That changed everything. And it was totally contrary to the foundations of this country, the United States. And it's created this devastated world economy, this death economy. It's given CEOs the license, some would say the mandate, to do whatever it takes to maximize profits, including corrupting the government, corrupting the democratic process. All we need to do is change that perceived reality. It's something like what happened in 1773. All we need to do is let corporations know that their job is to serve a public interest. It isn't to maximize profits. They need to make a decent rate of return for investors because we need investors to invest in the technologies that'll take us out of the death economy take us out of ravaging the earth and digging up resources to recycling and so on and so forth. But beyond that, the goal of corporations must be to serve us, you and me, the public. And I think most executives and most corporations would go along with that, but it would have to be something that we insist upon happening. It has to be a change of consciousness. And I think we're in the process of making that happen, but we got to make it happen faster. Every one of us has to get involved in this.
And what would you recommend are some basic steps and actions people can take?
Well, I have long lists in the book. The last several chapters of the New Confessions of an Economic Hitman is devoted exactly to that. And, I like to tell people, follow your passion, because that's what's successful. If your passion is carpentry, then build things using sustainable resources and tell your clients that you're doing that. If you're a dentist, while you get your hands in your clients' mouths, talk to them about the importance of a life economy. If you're a parent, let your children know about the importance of a life economy. Beyond that, I've got in the book long lists of things that corporate executives can do, entrepreneurs can do, retired people can do, students can do, middle-aged people can do, et cetera, et cetera. But here's three. I'll give you three specifics. I mean, there's a lot more in the book, but it's only limited by imagination. But here's three things. One, pick a company. If every one of your listeners picks a company, Walmart, Chevron, Nike, and send an email once a week to that company saying, I love your product, but I'm not going to buy it until you pay your workers in Indonesia a fair wage, or clean up the toxic waste you produced in the Amazon, or whatever like that. And ask all of your circle of social networking friends to send that same email out, and do that every week. A second thing you can do, and this is important during this presidential year, to recognize that the president is symbolically important, but doesn't have much real power. We've seen that very clearly. We thought the president had the power to appoint a Supreme Court justice. It looks like that's not even true. The corporations have the power. We have the power of the corporation. So look at whoever you choose, whoever you like as the presidential candidate, and what issues are most important to you. And make a commitment that whoever gets in the White House, whether it's your candidate or someone else, you will pursue that issue. If it's your candidate, you'll push your candidate to continue to push to move for that issue. If another candidate gets elected, you yourself will go out and do whatever it takes. You can use social media. You can form boycotts and demonstrations. There's all kinds of level of activity, but take action. Make commitment to taking action. And a third thing, become part of a movement. It could be a local movement, like to block a big box store in your community. A national movement, like the movement to amend the Constitution, or to get big business out of the voting process. Or it could be a global movement, like climate change regulations. But pick a movement and get involved. Support that movement through money or emails or energy or whatever. But the important thing, Mike, I think, is for everybody to recognize that we have the power, and that's what democracy is about. Let's take it. Let's enjoy it. So follow your passions. Go into one of these areas that you feel passionate about. It doesn't have to take a lot of time, but it can be really fun and really exciting. This is the greatest revolution in history. And the outcome of this revolution will determine whether we survive as a species or not. But this is not a violent revolution. We don't have to take up arms. We can blog, we can talk, we can dance, we can sing, we can do whatever we need to do to get the message out there, to convince corporations. They're totally dependent on us to buy their goods and services, invest in them, work for them, and support them through our tax dollars. We have the power.
Yep, absolutely. Just be more conscious about the decisions you make with your money and who you support, and it naturally takes care of itself. Couldn't agree more. Well, John, this has been an absolutely fascinating conversation. Where should people go to pick up a copy of your new book and get on your email list, connect with you on social, and all of that good stuff?
Well, thanks, Mike. The book's available anywhere books are sold, bookstores, online vendors, and people can go to my website. I really encourage them to, johnperkins.org. Sign up for my newsletter there. It comes out once a month, a couple of blogs a month. And I take people on trips to indigenous cultures, fascinating places in Ecuador, Colombia, Guatemala. I'd love to have some of your listeners join me. And also, I'm doing a lot of speaking these days. All of that information is at johnperkins.org. I'm also on Facebook at economic_hitman. and I'm on Twitter. So, join me. Let's keep the conversation going. And above all, I hope everybody gets excited about playing a role in this incredible revolution.
Awesome. Well, John, thank you so much for your leadership and your contribution in bringing transparency into how the world works to, the rest of us, and giving us that opportunity to make some very conscious decisions to shape it moving forward. It's unbelievably important. So thanks for joining us here on the podcast. Guys, go pick up your copy of the book. The stories are absolutely fascinating. And John, thank you for your time once again. I really appreciate it.
Well, my pleasure, Mike. And thank you for all you do to get the word out. It's so important, the role that you're playing this. I deeply, deeply appreciate it.
Thank you so much.